The Seo was stepping into the rain when a small, cold hand caught his sleeve. It wasn't a process server or a rival assassin. It was a child. Kim Do-hyun looked down. A little girl stood beside him, her red dress soaked through, mud streaking her pale face. In her trembling hand she held a piece of paper, completely blank. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the Seoul downpour. "Take me home." His security team moved in immediately, too aggressive, too fast. But Do-hyun raised a hand, stopping them dead. No one stopped Kim Do-hyun. People moved out of his way in silence. He crouched down, eye level with her, oblivious to the mud ruining his bespoke suit. "Where do you live, kid?" She just shook her head, tears finally breaking through. "I don't remember." That made him pause. She leaned in closer, her voice shaking. "They said if I asked for help they'd make sure I never find it." That's when he noticed her shivering frame and the way she stared at the blank paper like it was a map to a world that didn't exist. Kim Do-hyun took the empty paper not because he believed it, but because the look in her eyes was a reflection of the abandoned boy he had spent 20 years trying to forget. "Stay with me until the end, because the truth behind why this little girl had no address would eventually force the most powerful man in Korea to tear down the very empire he built." Before we continue, don't forget to like this video, subscribe, and tell us in the comments what you would do in his shoes. Now let's get started. Kim Do-hyun had spent 15 years climbing the glass towers of Seoul. He built his empire on two things: absolute control and total emotional detachment. His influence stretched from the boardrooms of Gangnam to the shipping lanes of Busan. Everyone knew the rules of the Do-hyun era. Efficiency was God and personal complications were a terminal sin. That Tuesday evening started like any other. Do-hyun was leaving the conglomerate's headquarters after a ruthless day of hostile takeovers. His armored sedan waited at the curb, engine humming, while his detail flanked him like statues. The city knew his routine. When the glass doors opened at 8:30 sharp, the street felt the chill. The smart ones looked away. But Emily Stone didn't look away. She didn't run. She walked straight toward the man the world feared, clutching a blank future in her tiny fist. Kim Do-hyun stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of his office on the 84th floor, watching the sunset bleed across the Seoul skyline. Below him, the city was a grid of light in motion, a machine he had spent 15 years learning to command. In the boardrooms of Gangnam, his name was synonymous with a surgical, bloodless efficiency. He was the man who turned failing giants into lean, profitable monsters. A titan who viewed the world not in people but in percentages and pivot tables. To the public, Do-hyun was a ghost behind a desk of polished obsidian. To his employees, he was a force of nature, unpredictable, unyielding, and entirely devoid of the sentimentality that crippled lesser men. He had built his reputation on two ironclad pillars. He always kept his word, and he made problems disappear before they could touch the bottom line. His territory wasn't measured in city blocks, but in market shares and shipping lanes that stretched from the docks of Busan to the tech hubs of the north. The rules of the Do-hyun era were well known to those who sought to survive within his orbit. You arrived early, you spoke only when the data was absolute, and you never, under any circumstances, brought personal complications into the workplace. He had seen desperate men beg for extensions on high-interest loans and watched legacy business owners weep as he signed the papers that dismantled their life's work. He had seen the smell and look of desperation 1,000 times, and it moved him no more than the hum of the air conditioning. That Tuesday evening, as the rain began to wash the neon-lit streets in a restless, blurring light, Do-hyun prepared to leave. His black armored sedan already waited at the curb, its engine purring with quiet, expensive power. His security detail, a pair of men who functioned more like human shields than bodyguards, stood flanking the entrance of the headquarters. The neighborhood knew his routine with a fearful precision. When Do-hyun emerged at 8:30 sharp, the atmosphere on the sidewalk changed. Store owners looked away and people found reasons to be on the other side of the street. He was a man who moved through the world without touching it, a figure of ice and steel who believed that emotions were merely weaknesses that led to arrest or ruin. He was the most powerful man in Seoul, and he was entirely alone, exactly as he intended to be. But as he stepped through the glass doors into the cold dampness of the night, the rules he had lived by for 15 years were about to be shattered by a tug on his sleeve. The black sedan was a fortress of leather and silence, a sanctuary that usually signaled the end of the day's wars for Kim Do-hyun. But as he stepped from the glass lobby of the headquarters into the relentless Seoul downpour, the air felt different, heavy and charged with a restless energy. The neon signs of the city blurred into streaks of jagged light against the pavement, washing the world in a cold, artificial glow. Do-hyun adjusted his collar, his eyes fixed on the waiting car, his mind already calculating the logistics of tomorrow's acquisition. He moved with a practiced predatory grace, the crowd parting before him as if by instinct. He was inches from the door when he felt it, a small, sharp tug at his sleeve. Do-hyun froze. His security detail reacted instantly, two shadows in suits closing the distance with terrifying speed, their hands moving toward their jackets. In his world, an unexpected touch was a threat, a breach that required immediate correction. But as Do-hyun turned, the reprimand died in his throat. A little girl stood beside him. She was drenched, her hair matted against her forehead and her red dress clinging to a frame so thin it looked like the wind might snap it. Mud was streaked across her cheeks, yet she didn't flinch as the bodyguards loomed over her. In her trembling hand she clutched a crumpled piece of paper. Do-hyun looked down, expecting a ransom note or a plea for money, but the paper was hauntingly blank. She leaned closer, her movement so fragile it made the air around them feel brittle. The smell of rain and cold dampness clung to her. Then she whispered into his ear, a sound barely louder than the rhythm of the falling water. "Take me home." The words were a ghost of a sound, yet they hit Do-hyun with more force than any hostile takeover. He had faced ruthless competitors and federal investigators without blinking, but this child's voice unsettled him in a way he couldn't name. He crouched down, ignoring the mud that stained his $1,000 trousers, bringing himself eye level with her. For the first time in 15 years, the Titan of Seoul looked at another human being with something other than calculation. "Where do you live, Emily?" he asked, his voice low and uncharacteristically gentle. The girl shook her head slowly, her eyes wide and searching. "I don't remember." Behind them, the city buzzed on, indifferent and fast. Cars splashed through puddles and commuters hurried past, none of them noticing the most powerful man in the country kneeling in the dirt. Do-hyun felt something crack inside his chest, a long-buried memory of being lost, invisible and abandoned on these very same streets. He looked at the blank paper again. No address. No name. No clue. He took off his heavy wool jacket and wrapped it around her small, shivering shoulders. "Okay," he said quietly, lifting her into his arms. "Then I'll find it." As he stepped into the sedan, the city lights flickered behind them like a past he could never escape, and a future he had just chosen. He had spent his life making problems disappear, but for the first time he was determined to make one person reappear. Inside the cavernous, dimly lit backseat of the sedan, Kim Do-hyun watched Emily Stone. She had fallen into a shallow, fitful sleep against the window, his wool jacket swallowing her small frame. In the soft glow of the passing streetlights, her face looked like a porcelain mask, fragile, beautiful and completely anonymous. To the rest of Seoul she didn't exist, and as Do-hyun opened his laptop he began to realize just how deep that void went. He bypassed the standard corporate filters and accessed the conglomerate's private high-level data node. Do-hyun was a man who believed that everyone left a footprint. A hospital record, a school enrollment, a digital shadow. He typed the name Emily Stone into the search bar. The screen flickered, processing millions of data points across national ID registries and immigration logs. The result was a cold, flashing cursor. No matches found. He tightened his jaw and ran a secondary search through the facial recognition software used by his security firm, cross-referencing the girl's image against every missing person report in East Asia. Again the screen remained stubbornly empty. It was as if Emily had dropped from the sky into the mud of Seoul without a history, a mother, or a home. In a world where Do-hyun prided himself on making problems disappear, he found himself staring at a problem that had never legally appeared. His eyes drifted back to the crumpled, blank paper Emily had handed him. In his line of work he knew that a blank was rarely an accident. Often it was a deliberate erasure. He began to dig deeper, moving past public records and into the encrypted gray files of his own organization, the place where the conglomerate stashed the things it didn't want the world to see. A faint, cold chill settled in his stomach. He remembered his own childhood, how the state had wiped his records after his parents vanished, leaving him a ghost in the system until he carved out a name for himself through sheer ruthless will. Looking at Emily, he realized she wasn't just lost. She was being hidden. Someone had gone to great lengths to ensure that Emily Stone had no past to return to. As the sedan sped toward his penthouse, Do-hyun realized he wasn't just looking for an address anymore. He was looking for a ghost in his own machine. He closed the laptop with a sharp click, his decision made. If the world had decided she didn't exist, he would be the one to prove the world wrong. The digital silence of Kim Dong-hyun's office was broken only by the rhythmic hum of his cooling fans as he delved deeper into the conglomerate's encrypted gray files. He navigated through layers of corporate security that he himself had helped design, searching for any footprint that led back to Emily Stone. For years he had operated under the belief that his organization was a machine of perfect efficiency, a collection of assets moving toward a single profitable goal. But as the clock on his desk ticked toward midnight, he began to see the jagged edges of a parallel operation functioning within his own shadows. He discovered a series of redacted service contracts buried under a defunct subsidiary, logistics agreements for special site clearances, and personnel relocation that bypassed every standard oversight committee. These weren't standard business deals. They were the blueprints for an erasure. The signatures on the digital authorizations were encrypted with high-level keys that only a handful of people in the executive wing possessed. These were the erasers, a silent cabal of his own board members and security leads who had turned his empire's efficiency into a weapon for making human lives disappear. Do-hyun felt a cold, familiar anger tightening in his chest. These men were pushing drugs and running protection rackets under the guise of corporate growth, crossing the lines of honor he had spent 15 years trying to maintain. They had targeted Emily's family because her father was a whistleblower, someone who saw the rot and refused to look away. By taking her mother and wiping the girl's records, they had attempted to delete the last piece of evidence of their crimes. He leaned back, the blue light of the monitor reflecting in his eyes, which held a look he rarely showed anymore. The look of a man who had seen every kind of evil and was no longer afraid of it. He realized that the Koff brothers and the internal traitors weren't just testing his territory, they were testing his soul. They assumed he would treat Emily as a casualty of business, a minor complication to be handled with a payout or a quiet dismissal. They were wrong. As he stared at the blurred photos of the shipping container yard where the relocations were finalized, Do-hyun realized that to save the girl he would have to go to war with the very world he had spent his life building. He picked up his secure phone and made a single call. "Round up everyone," he said, his voice like ice-cold steel. "We're going to war." Kim Dong-hyun sat in the heavy silence of his study, the blue light from the monitors casting long, cold shadows across the room. He looked at the business card on his desk, a simple piece of cardstock that represented the clean, clinical world he had built, and then at the blank paper Emily Stone had carried. The void on that page felt like a physical weight. As the rain continued to lash against the glass, the rhythmic tapping began to pull at a thread in his mind that he had kept tightly wound for decades. He closed his eyes and suddenly, the scent of expensive leather and air-filtered oxygen was replaced by the smell of wet asphalt and rotting trash. He was no longer the titan of Seoul. He was a terrified 7-year-old standing on a street corner in the shadows of the very towers he now owned. He remembered the feeling of a hand slipping out of his own, his mother's hand, and the sound of footsteps retreating into the fog. She had told him to wait there, to be brave, and that she would be back before the streetlights flickered to life. He had waited. He had stood there until his legs grew numb and the rain soaked through his thin shirt, turning his skin into a map of goosebumps. He remembered looking at the passing faces, hundreds of them, and realizing with a sudden, sharp clarity that he was invisible. To the world rushing by, he was just another shadow in a city that had no room for the abandoned. That night, the boy he used to be had died, replaced by a cold, hollow shell that understood one thing: the world only noticed those who forced it to look. He opened his eyes and looked at Emily, who was curled up on the sofa, still wearing his jacket. The way her small hand clutched the fabric even in sleep mirrored the way he had once clutched a button from his mother's coat. Something shifted deep inside his chest, a tectonic movement of a heart he thought had turned to stone. For 15 years he had built walls to ensure he would never be that invisible boy again, but looking at Emily he realized the walls hadn't just kept the world out. They had kept his humanity locked in a dark room. The internal rules he lived by, the ones that commanded him to never get emotional and to treat people as mere variables, cracked. He wasn't just helping a lost girl anymore. He was answering the cry of the boy who had waited on that street corner for a hero who never came. He realized that whatever Emily Stone was about to ask of him was worth far more than the market cap of his entire empire. He reached out and gently tucked the jacket tighter around her, his jaw set with a new, dangerous purpose. He would find her home even if he had to burn his own world down to light the way. The heavy, reinforced doors of Kim Dong-hyun's penthouse clicked shut, sealing out the roar of the Seoul rain and the predatory hum of the city below. Inside, the air was still and smelled faintly of expensive cedar and filtered oxygen. The apartment was a monument to modern minimalism. Vast, open spaces, walls of cold marble and glass that offered a panoramic view of the empire Dong-hyun had conquered. 4 years, this place had been his fortress of solitude, a sterile environment where no personal complications were ever permitted to enter. Now, the silence was broken by the soft, rhythmic dripping of water from a small red dress onto the pristine hardwood floor. Dong-hyun didn't call for his staff. He didn't want witnesses to the crack in his armor. Instead, he led Emily Stone toward the guest wing, a section of the penthouse that had remained untouched since the day he moved in. He moved with a quiet, uncharacteristic gentleness, his large hand resting lightly on her shoulder as if she were made of the same fragile porcelain as the artifacts in his display cases. He realized that to a child who had been living as a ghost, this glass palace must have felt like another world, one where the shadows couldn't reach her. "You're safe here," he said, his voice low and grounding. Emily didn't respond with words, but her grip on his oversized wool jacket tightened, her wide brown eyes scanning the shadows of the hallway. She looked like a small bird seeking shelter in the hollow of a great stone cliff. Dong-hyun found a set of silk pajamas, a gift from a forgotten business associate, and laid them out. He watched as she sat on the edge of the massive bed, her legs swinging back and forth, appearing impossibly small against the backdrop of his high-altitude life. As she finally began to drift into a heavy, drug-like sleep of the truly exhausted, Dong-hyun stood by the window, looking out at the city lights that flickered like a past he could never escape. He knew that this sanctuary was only temporary. The erasers within his own board were already moving, their digital tendrils searching for the girl they thought they had deleted. He looked back at Emily, noticing for the first time how her breathing had finally slowed into a peaceful rhythm. For the first time in 15 years, the penthouse didn't feel like a fortress. It felt like a home. He realized then that he wasn't just providing her a safe haven. He was protecting the only piece of truth left in a world built on lies. He would keep her hidden in this sanctuary until he was ready to turn the city upside down to find the rest of her story. The blue light of the monitors reflected in Kim Dong-hyun's eyes as he sat in the center of his darkened penthouse, a silent predator preparing for a strike. He knew that the war he was about to wage against the erasers could not be fought with corporate memos or legal filings. It required a team that operated outside the traditional boundaries of his empire. For 15 years, Dong-hyun had built his reputation on loyalty and surgical precision, and now it was time to call in the men who understood that some jobs required a different kind of honor. He reached for his secure phone and made a series of calls that rippled through the city like dark water. Within the hour, the heavy, soundproof doors of his study opened to admit 4 men who had been with him since the early days of the East Side. Men who were ex-military or former law enforcement, each handpicked for their absolute loyalty and their ability to handle business without creating unnecessary heat. They stood before his desk, their presence grounding the sterile luxury of the penthouse with a gritty, tactical reality. "Listen up," Dong-hyun said, his voice dropping to a low, ice-cold steel that signaled the gravity of the mission. He placed the blank paper Emily Stone had carried on the desk, followed by a digital tablet showing the redacted contracts of the Shadow subsidiary. He explained that a line had been crossed that shouldn't exist. A child had been targeted and her family erased by the very machine they had all helped build. Several of the men shifted uncomfortably. In their world, children changed everything, and the idea of relocating a mother for a corporate cover-up was a low that even they found unacceptable. Dong-hyun assigned their roles with the same cold efficiency he used for a hostile takeover. One was to infiltrate the logistics hub at the docks to find the physical records of the personnel relocations, while the others were to put every crew member on standby with full weapons. This wasn't just a business dispute anymore. It was personal. As the men prepared to depart, Do-hyun looked at the digital map of Seoul's container yards, his jaw set in a hard line. He was no longer just a CEO protecting an asset. He was a guardian of the neighborhood, leading a shadow army to reclaim a home that had been stolen. They moved out like ghosts, leaving Do-hyun alone with the sleeping child in the next room, his resolve as unyielding as the towers he commanded. The investigation into Emily Stone's missing address led Kim Dong-hyun's team deep into the digital archives of a subsidiary that had been quietly dissolved 5 years prior. While the public records for the neighborhood where Emily supposedly lived showed nothing but a newly constructed high-rise complex, the Loyalists found the original city planning blueprints buried in a delisted server. These documents revealed that an entire street, a block of modest apartments once known as Hope Lane, had been physically and legally scrubbed from the map to make way for the conglomerate's expansion. The erasers hadn't just moved a family, they had systematically deleted the physical proof of their existence, replacing the history of the neighborhood with glass and steel. Do-hyun pored over the recovered ledger, his jaw tightening as he found the entry for Emily's home. Unit 4B Hope Lane. Status: relocated to Facility 15. Authorization: internal security. There was no mention of where Facility 15 was located, but the logistical footprint of the move led directly toward the industrial container yard by the river, the same place where the erasers kept their most sensitive personnel assets. Standing in his office, Do-hyun looked at the blank paper Emily had carried. It wasn't that she didn't have an address. It was that her address had been stolen by the very company he had spent 15 years building into a titan. He realized that the missing home wasn't a failure of her memory, but a success of his organization's ruthlessness. Every high-rise he had authorized and every acquisition he had celebrated now felt like a stone laid over a grave. He turned away from the panoramic view of the city, the neon lights no longer looking like a conquest, but like a distraction. The erasers thought they had buried the truth under a decade of corporate filings, but they hadn't accounted for a child who refused to forget the smell of lavender soap or the feel of a home that no longer existed on any map. Do-hyun picked up his secure phone and sent a single coordinate to his team: the river container yard. He wasn't tracing a missing address anymore. He was going to reclaim it from the shadows. The black SUVs moved through the neon-drenched streets of Seoul like predators in the tall grass, their tinted windows reflecting the jagged, restless light of the city. Inside the lead vehicle, Kim Dong-hyun sat in total silence, the green glow of tactical tablets illuminating his sharp features. He wasn't thinking about profit margins or market share tonight. He was thinking about a street called Hope Lane that had been wiped off the map, and a little girl named Emily Stone who was currently sleeping in a glass tower, waiting for a man she barely knew to bring back her world. The convoy bypassed the high-traffic zones, weaving through the industrial underbelly of the city where the erasers operated with impunity. Do-hyun watched the city change from the gleaming towers of his empire to the rusted, skeletal remains of the warehouse district. This was the territory of the Shadow subsidiary, a place where people were treated as cargo and lives were redacted with a keystroke. He checked his sidearm, a habit from a past he had tried to bury, and felt a cold, familiar clarity. Tonight he wasn't the CEO, he was the hammer. Sal's team is in position on the north perimeter. A voice crackled through his earpiece. Marco has the south entrance covered. 2 guards eliminated quietly. Bodies concealed. Do-hyun nodded, his eyes fixed on the shipping container yard that stretched toward the black water of the river. It was a labyrinth of steel, thousands of containers stacked like the tombs of a forgotten civilization. Somewhere in that maze was Facility 15. Somewhere in that maze was the mother of the girl who had whispered into his ear. As the SUVs pulled up 2 blocks away, the team moved out like ghosts, their movements synchronized by years of shared violence and absolute loyalty. They avoided the sweep of the rusted searchlights, staying in the deep shadows cast by the towering stacks of metal. The air tasted of salt oil and the metallic tang of fear. Do-hyun led the breach, his movements precise and lethal. He realized that the erasers hadn't just hidden Emily's past, they had built a fortress around their crimes, confident that no one would ever care enough to look. They reached the first perimeter of the inner yard, where the containers were newer and the security was heavy. Through his thermal goggles, Do-hyun saw the heat signatures of guards pacing the roof lines. He signaled for the advance. This was the moment where the tactical operation met the emotional reality of his mission. He wasn't just clearing a site, he was reclaiming a life. As the first flashbang detonated, shattering the silence of the docks, Do-hyun stepped into the light, his jaw set in a hard line. The war for Emily Stone had begun, and he wouldn't stop until the shadows were burned away. The breach of the inner yard was a symphony of precision and violence, but for Kim Do-hyun, the world had narrowed down to a single number: 7. He moved through the labyrinth of stacked steel with a lethal focus, his team felling the erasers, who scrambled to defend their dark enterprise. The air was thick with the scent of ozone and the heavy, metallic tang of industrial decay. Every guard who raised a weapon or even looked toward him with intent was neutralized before they could draw breath. Do-hyun wasn't just reclaiming territory, he was cutting through the rot of his own empire to find the one truth that still mattered. He reached Container 7, its corrugated surface rusted and scarred, hidden behind a barricade of legitimate cargo. It was a tomb masquerading as commerce. He signaled for the breach, and as the heavy doors were pried open with a shriek of tortured metal, the clinical silence of his former life was replaced by a sound that made his blood run cold: the soft, broken whimpering of someone who had long ago given up on being found. Inside, the space was cramped and smelled of antiseptic and fear. Rosa Stone was slumped in a chair, her eyes unfocused and her frame skeletal, the victim of a system that viewed human beings as data to be deleted. She looked up as Do-hyun stepped into the dim light, her expression a mask of confusion and terror. "Who are you?" she whispered, her voice a ghost of the one Emily had used in the rain. "I'm a friend of your daughter's," Do-hyun said, his voice dropping into a low, grounding tone that felt foreign in this place of violence. "Emily sent me. She's safe and she's waiting for you." The mention of her daughter's name acted like a physical shock, pulling Rosa back from the brink of despair. Tears began to track through the grime on her face, not tears of fear, but of a hope so sudden it was painful. Do-hyun reached out, his hand steady as he helped her to her feet, realizing that this woman had survived 3 days of hell because a 7-year-old girl refused to believe the world was entirely dark. As he led her out into the cool night air of the docks, he felt the weight of his promise to Emily finally beginning to lift. He had found the home she couldn't remember, and he would burn every bridge behind them to ensure they never had to leave it again. He looked toward the SUV where his team was already coordinating the cleanup, his jaw set. The rescue was complete, but the war for their future was only just beginning. The warehouse fell into a heavy, artificial silence as Kim Do-hyun turned his attention away from the containers and toward the glass-walled office overlooking the yard. Inside, the men who had orchestrated this erasure, members of his own board and his head of internal security, were frozen, their faces pale under the harsh fluorescent lights. They had watched the surgical destruction of their private army on the monitors, and now, as the heavy steel door was kicked open, they were faced with the man they had underestimated. Do-hyun stepped into the room, his presence filling the confined space like a gathering storm. He didn't reach for his weapon, he didn't need to. The sheer weight of his fury was enough to pin them to their leather chairs. On the table sat stacks of counting cash and a ledger of human lives sold like merchandise, the very definition of the special work they had forced upon the vulnerable. "Business is business," Do-hyun, the oldest board member, stammered, his voice thin and desperate. "We can work this out. The woman is worth a fortune to the right buyers. We split the cut 60-40. Everyone walks away happy." Do-hyun stepped closer, his shadow falling over the ledger. "Let me tell you about that woman," he said, his voice a low, terrifying hum of ice-cold steel. "Her name is Rosa Stone. She is a widow who worked 2 jobs to support her daughter, Emily. You took her mother, you threatened a child, and you laughed while she cried because you thought they were nobodies in your territory." He pulled out his phone and played the video they had forced Rosa to record, the one where she begged for Emily's safety while they laughed in the background. The board members exchanged glances, realizing too late that they hadn't just crossed a business line. They had crossed a moral one that Do-hyun had spent 15 years defending. "You're wrong," Do-hyun whispered, leaning over the table. "This couldn't be more personal. You thought you were operating in the shadows of my empire, but tonight, I am the one who is deleting you." What happened next took exactly 90 seconds. When it was over, The trafficking operation that had rotted the core of his corporation was permanently closed. Do-hyun walked out of the office without looking back, leaving the erasers to the justice of the men he had brought with him. As he descended the stairs toward the waiting SUV where Rosa Stone was being treated, he felt the heavy, suffocating weight of his corporate title finally begin to slip away. His business with the board was over, but his promise to a 7-year-old girl was nearly complete. The black SUV pulled to a stop at the curb of a quiet, darkened street, its headlights cutting through the silver sheets of rain that continued to wash over Seoul. Inside the vehicle, the silence was heavy, broken only by the rhythmic click of the hazard lights. Kim Dong-hyun looked at Rosa Stone, who sat beside him, clutching a dry blanket he had provided. She was trembling not from the cold but from the sheer overwhelming weight of the last 3 days. He didn't speak. He knew that words were hollow in the face of such a reunion. He stepped out into the downpour, the cold water immediately soaking through his shirt, and opened the door for her. Across the sidewalk, the neon sign of a small convenience store flickered, the place where he had left Emily Stone under the watchful eye of a trusted shopkeeper. The door chimed as they entered, a sound that felt like the tolling of a bell marking the end of a long night. Emily was sitting on a high stool behind the counter, her small legs swinging back and forth, her eyes fixed on the entrance. When the door opened and she saw the man in the wet suit, her breath hitched. But then she saw the woman standing behind him. "Mama." The word was a fragile whisper, barely audible over the hum of the refrigerators. Emily launched herself off the stool, her small feet hitting the linoleum with a frantic patter. Rosa fell to her knees, her arms reaching out as Emily collided with her, a force of nature fueled by 3 days of terror and hope. They collapsed into each other on the floor of the quiet store, a tangle of red fabric and exhausted sobs. Rosa held her daughter so tight it looked as if she were trying to pull the child back inside her heart, whispering apologies and endearments into her matted hair. Dong-hyun stood by the door, his hands in his pockets, watching the scene from the shadows. He had built an empire by destroying his competitors and mastering the cold logic of the market, but as he watched the two of them, he felt a warmth that no amount of profit could ever provide. He had kept his word. He had found the home that Emily couldn't remember, not on a map, but in the arms of the person who loved her. The shopkeeper wiped her eyes and retreated to the back, giving them privacy. Dong-hyun looked out at the rain-slicked street, realizing that for the first time in 15 years, he wasn't thinking about the next acquisition or the morning's stock prices. He was simply a man standing in the rain, watching the only thing in the city that was real. Midnight had passed and justice had been delivered, not by a court or a board, but by a promise made to a girl with a blank piece of paper. Kim Dong-hyun stood by the glass door of the convenience store, watching the reflection of the neon lights ripple in the puddles outside. Inside, the air was warm and smelled of cedar and the lavender soap Emily had mentioned once before. He reached into the inner pocket of his tailored suit jacket and pulled out the crumpled blank piece of paper Emily had handed him in the rain. It was a worthless scrap of stationery to the rest of the world, but to him, it was a contract more binding than any merger he had ever signed. He walked over to where Emily and Rosa sat on the floor, their lives finally stitched back together. He knelt one last time, bringing himself down to Emily's level. The girl looked at him, her eyes no longer wide with the hollow fear of the abandoned, but bright with a quiet, exhausted peace. Dong-hyun held out the blank paper, placing it gently in her small hand. "Your payment is being refunded," he said, his voice carrying a slight, rare smile that reached his eyes. "Consider the job completed at no charge." Emily looked down at the paper, then back up at him, her brow furrowed in confusion. "But I hired you," she whispered, her voice steady for the first time. "That was our deal." "You gave me something worth more than any corporate title tonight, Emily," Dong-hyun replied. He looked at the high-rise towers visible through the store window, the glass and steel monuments to a life spent in cold calculation. "You reminded me why I started all of this. Sometimes we forget that power isn't about how much you can take. It's about who you choose to protect." He stood up, feeling a strange light sensation in his chest, as if the suffocating weight of his reputation had finally dissolved in the rain. He turned to his head of security who was waiting by the SUV. "Call the board," Dong-hyun commanded, his tone absolute. "Tell them I'm resigning effective immediately. I'm liquidating my personal shares to establish a foundation for families affected by site clearances." The Empire can find a new titan. I have a different role to fill now. Rosa looked up at him, her eyes filled with a gratitude that moved him more than any standing ovation in a boardroom. What happens to you now? She asked. Now, I make sure that no other child in this city ever has to hold a blank piece of paper, Do-hyun said. He looked back at Emily one last time. And I start by making sure you two have a home that no one can ever erase. He stepped back into the rain, but this time he didn't wrap himself in the cold armor of his jacket. He walked toward the car with a new, dangerous purpose. He had rejected his crown, but for the first time in 15 years he felt like a king. He was no longer the man who made problems disappear. He was the man who made people reappear. 3 months later, the neon lights of Seoul still flickered with a restless energy. But for Kim Do-hyun, the view from a small, modest office in the heart of the city felt far more significant than the panorama from his former glass fortress. He was no longer the titan of Seoul, but the silence of his new workspace was filled with a purpose that high-stakes mergers had never provided. He sat at his desk, not reviewing market shares or hostile takeovers, but reading a simple hand-drawn picture that Mrs. Chin had delivered earlier that afternoon. Inside the envelope was a drawing of 3 stick figures holding hands under a bright, multicolored rainbow. At the bottom, in the careful, earnest handwriting of a 7-year-old, were the words, "Thank you, Mr. Do-hyun. Love, Emily and Mama." Do-hyun, a man who had never framed corporate awards or newspaper clippings of his billion-dollar deals, stood up and carefully pinned the drawing to the wall. It sat right next to a map of the city neighborhoods he was now working to protect. A reminder that the most powerful man in the neighborhood is the one who remembers exactly what he is guarding. The blank paper Emily Stone had once carried in the rain had become the foundation of a new legacy. Through his foundation, Do-hyun had begun dismantling the shadow subsidiaries that specialized in erasure, replacing them with legal and social safeguards for families who had been made invisible. He had used his remaining influence to ensure that Emily Stone grew up safe, her identity no longer a ghost in a machine, but a record of a life reclaimed. Emily flourished. She grew up in a home that no one could ever delete, graduating high school and eventually becoming a teacher, dedicating her life to the children who felt lost in the shadows of the city's great towers. Every year, on the anniversary of that rainy night outside the conglomerate headquarters, she would leave a small envelope at Do-hyun's office. Inside was always the same thing, a single crisp note and a blank piece of paper with a message written on the back. For the next person who needs to be found. Do-hyun kept every single one. They were a testament to the fact that courage does not depend on the size of an empire or the fear one's name inspires. Standing before his wall of drawings and notes, he realized that sometimes the bravest person in the room is simply a child with hope and the willingness to ask for help. He looked out at the city, no longer a predatory machine, but a place where a home could be built for anyone brave enough to seek it. It was exactly what he had chosen, and finally, it was exactly what the world needed. Driven by a buried memory of his own abandoned childhood, Do-hyun discovers that Emily is the daughter of a whistleblower whose family and home were erased by a shadow operation within his own conglomerate. To keep his promise to her, he risks his reputation and leads a tactical strike against his own corrupt board members to rescue Emily's kidnapped mother from a hidden facility.